Welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get us started today. My name is Bart Kettle. I'm with the Division of Oil, Gas and Mining Deputy Director in the Oil and Gas Program. So thank you for everybody for coming. A little bit of weather coming in today. We weren't sure how many people would get, and of course October is generally the least attended collaborative meeting, but glad to see all of you here today. So to start with, I'll just cover a couple of things that I think might be of interest for the group. It's been kind of an interesting last year. I think that's been covered by many people many times. One of the interesting things, at least specifically to oil and gas, is the price of commodity. So oil going over $80 a barrel recently, the price of natural gas hitting the $5, even $5.50 MCF range. That's kind of an interesting recent development. We've seen prices just kind of gradually increase over the last year. I think probably most of us in this room are kind of wondering, well, what does that mean and what comes next? And of course, I don't know the answer to that either. We are seeing the number of wells in the state spudded up dramatically over last year. So spuds are just when wells are started to be drilled. And here in September and October, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the number of applications for permits to drill to be submitted. We don't know if that'll sustain. We've seen a really big uptick in kind of May and June this year. It worried us a little bit, actually. We worried if we were being able to keep up with it as a regulatory body, and then it kind of stalled through the summer months, but we're seeing a few more applications for permit to drill being submitted again. I did not check prior to coming into this meeting, but last time I checked, we were sitting right at 10 rigs drilling in the state. So that's a lot better than 0 from last year. And then the other thing I was going to just cover briefly, I don't have a ton of insight on it, but I know everybody's probably keeping an eye on it at some level is what the ultimate decision with the Surface Transportation Board would be for the Uinta Railway. A final EIS has been issued. I tried to check just barely prior to kind of coming up here. It doesn't look like there's a record of decision on that, so that's still pending. But that'll be another thing that I think probably most of us in this room will be interested as it moves forward. So as we get ready to start today, what I'm going to do is turn the mic over to John Bozzo, Director of the Division of Oil, Gas and Mining, for just a moment to talk about a couple things, and then we'll have 2 presenters come through and present today. So.
Thanks a lot, Bart. I appreciate you giving us the introduction to the meeting today. It's interesting. This is one of the outreach activities that we do as a division. And at least for the oil and gas program, it is probably one of the biggest forms of outreach. Some of the other things we do is we have a quarterly newsletter that goes out to various people. If that's something that you want to receive, we can certainly get your name on a mailing list or an email list for that. But the things that we've tried to do with this meeting is to educate and inform, to bring up issues that are relevant to oil and gas development here in the basin. I think you're going to see 2 presentations today, which maybe be beyond the scope of what many of you deal with on a daily basis, but it involves both the critical minerals that we have in the state of Utah and helium development. Those are both things that are on the horizon and are pretty important to the state of Utah into the future as we think strategically about the energy and the minerals that provide our quality of life here in the state. I think that we're going to see a lot more activity in both of those realms as time goes forward. I've even heard talk of how critical minerals could possibly be extracted out of the produced waters that we have in the Uinta Basin, and using those to create more value from that material. Some of the things that you'll probably see as time goes on is we're hearing a lot of talk about hydrogen development in the state. Hydrogen is kind of one of those fuels of the future that could be a big move towards kind of modifying our transportation fleet, our electrical generation in the state. Along with that comes the idea of CO2 sequestration or carbon capture and putting that CO2 back in the ground. that comes along with developing hydrogen from various sources. So as those things develop, we may see presentations along those lines at these meetings into the future. All of this is important because I think you're seeing from Washington, D.C., a lot of messaging going out right now about global supply chains. And it's something in the petroleum industry which we've recognized for years, right? We have a global supply chain in the oil and gas business. And often the imports of foreign petroleum dictate what the price is that we have to live with as for commodities here in the U.S. But it's becoming more and more relevant that as goods and products are shipped from overseas, that they're getting caught up in this bottleneck of shipping. And that is going to affect oil, natural gas, all kinds of things into the future. So it's going to be a wild ride, and we'll do our best to try to inform again and educate as time goes on. Many years ago when I took this job, one of my fondest desires was to say, well, can't we make oil, gas, and mining more of a household word? Because frankly, people along the Wasatch Front, they get their gasoline out of a tank at the convenience store and they don't think twice about it. Here in the Uinta Basin, that's different. Everybody understands what oil and gas means to the quality of life out here, but a great majority of the population does not. And so that's part of the reason we try to do a lot of education and outreach in meetings just like this. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn the time back to Bart and let him continue with the agenda today. I'll be here through the whole time, so please feel free to come up and ask me a question if you need to.
Okay, thank you, John. So our first presentation today will be by Stephanie Mills with the Utah Geologic Survey. What I'll do is I will let Stephanie introduce herself. So Stephanie, if you want to start to get your presentation up and give an introduction, we'll pause while you do that.
All right. Is the presentation showing?
Presentation is showing and is going into presentation mode right now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for having me today. My name is Stephanie Mills, and I can already hear it. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, not COVID, thankfully, but I'm a little bit stuffy, so I do apologize. I'm a senior geologist with the Utah Geological Survey, so I'm one of the two senior economic geologists. I deal with the metal resources, and then my colleague Andrew Repke deals with industrial minerals resources. Today, talking about critical minerals, that does cover both of those metals and industrial minerals. So depending on people's questions, I might have to direct some of you to Andrew at some point, but I will do my best. So we'll get into critical minerals. I'll try to go through this relatively quickly. I find sometimes it's better with critical minerals to leave a lot of time for questions because there's so many different ways to approach this topic. So I'll give us a really basic starting point and we can go from there. So just to start with, a little bit of a plug for some publications from the Utah Geological Survey, the most relevant being a publication myself and Andrew put out in 2020 called Critical Minerals of Utah. And this is just a summary of basically all the critical minerals in Utah, kind of how advanced the resources, what the potential is, what we don't have any potential for, things like that. So if you just are trying to get a grasp on what is going on with this whole hysteria around critical minerals, this is a good place for you to start. It's available for free on our website, geology.utah.gov. The other one is we do put out an annual mining report. We're running a little behind on the 2020 report, but the annual mining report always has updates for that year as to what was happening in the mining industry, both metals and industrial minerals. And now we're basically treating critical minerals almost as its own subcategory within that. And again, also for free on geology.utah.gov. So getting into the thick of it, what is a critical mineral? There is a lot of language going around right now. Critical minerals, battery metals, future metals, strategic metals, green metals, all sorts of things. Critical minerals is the best defined of all of those groups. And actually, for the most part, most of those subgroups are covered by the umbrella of critical minerals. Critical minerals is a term that serves for something that is designated by the government. So in our case, critical minerals were defined by the US Geological Survey. And it's basically identifying minerals that are essential to domestic economy and security. They're susceptible to supply chain vulnerability. And if we were to lose them, it has very significant effects. So those are the three criteria. The USGS came out with the initial critical minerals list in 2018, but it's kind of written into, I guess, the charter for critical minerals that they review this list every 3 years. So in 2021, this year, they have actually done a review. The figure that I'm showing here on the right is just a basic periodic table. All of the elements that are highlighted in green were critical minerals that were identified in 2018 and were evaluated to be still worthy of the critical mineral designation in 2021. The blue elements are those that were removed or not evaluated in 2021. And the reason I say not evaluated is uranium, because it's a fuel mineral, they didn't even look at it anymore, and they just decided to kind of, I guess for all intents and purposes, kind of ignore uranium from now on. And then the two elements in red, nickel, and zinc were actually added in 2021. They were evaluated as now meeting the threshold criteria for being a critical mineral. I'm going to have another figure that shows this more relative to Utah, but I wanted to start out with just what the national definition that we're all working from is. And this is currently the best this is the representation of where the United States critical mineral theme currently stands. Please do keep in mind other countries like Canada and Australia in particular. They also have critical minerals, but their list is different because their country has different supply chain vulnerabilities. So just if someone's talking about critical minerals, make sure you know which country's list they are talking about. So I wanted to include a slide, kind of obviously green energy, a transition to carbon neutral energy production is, that's as big in the minerals industry as it is in the oil and gas industry. Critical minerals covers a lot of the elements that are metals, I guess, that are deemed to be necessary for this kind of energy transition. However, there are some significant ones that are not critical minerals. And I want to call attention to these in particular, because one of the most significant metals that we need for the energy transition and even just energy growth and economic growth is actually copper. And I think most people would recognize that copper is a very significant commodity in Utah due to Bingham Canyon and other areas as well. Utah actually has very good copper potential. So the figure that I'm showing here is from the World Bank. That top, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the elements, the metals that are written in black, these are all of the metals that are deemed necessary for the energy transition. And on the right-hand side is which kind of energy bucket they're necessary for. And as you can see, copper is necessary just straight across the board. So copper is really, really essential to everything we do. And the reason I point this out every time I talk about critical minerals is I don't want there to be so much focus on critical minerals at the cost of other things that are very, very essential as well. The other elements that have a red arrow next to them, iron, lead, molybdenum, and silver, those are not critical minerals, but they are, and particularly with respect to Utah, those are actually things we produce silver, molybdenum, and iron, and we have high potential for lead production as well. Actually, we produce lead as a byproduct. I take it back. We produce all of those. So all of those things with the red arrow, we also produce. So any sort of economic planning and things like that want to take into consideration mineral future needs to consider both critical minerals as well as, energy metals. This is why there's not a good cohesion around the language, because then we struggle with what to call it. And just to make a final point on this slide, neither critical minerals nor this figure from the World Bank that I'm showing right here actually takes into consider industrial minerals such as aggregate. And it is going to take an astounding amount of aggregate, basically concrete, to build the infrastructure that we need. So industrial minerals, again, is a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to critical minerals. I wanted to bring this up specifically. I think actually John Baza kind of made a slight reference to it. So this was a really great moment for the UGS as well. The Department of Energy has been giving out some substantially large grants for initiatives looking at rare earth element production from essentially coal waste. And this Department of Energy grant, the mining engineering department at the University of Utah actually approached us, UGS, to be a part of their application. We are involved in that. We'll be studying our core and things like that. We don't have quite enough personnel to cover the size of this grant, so also the geology department at the University of Utah is involved. But this was a successful grant looking at the Uinta River Basin, and it was a $1.5 million grant for phase 1. There will be a phase 2, which I think is even larger. And this grant is basically going to look at all carbon sources and how we can look at extracting rare earth elements and critical minerals out of them. And it looks actually all the way down the supply chain at, all the way down to how do we produce carbon nanotubes and things like that. So it's a really impressive supply chain spanning study that UGS is the part of. And so we're very proud and happy that we can continue to represent Utah's mineral interest and oil and gas interest and mineral interest in this space. So this study will be going on, I think it's 1.5 million for the first year or 2 years. I might have forgotten that part. I apologize. But if you have any questions about that, we would be happy to talk more about this. All right, so moving into Utah's minerals, just as an overview, this is a figure from our annual mining report. The little polygons, so the purple, green, and yellow shapes show mining districts. That's basically where a whole bunch of mines are clustered together, and they kind of represent favorable geology for minerals. And then we also have the red squares are industrial mineral sites. So basically demonstrating that you can see there's a lot of mineral potential all the way across the state. We currently produce, I've got everything listed there. I don't want to just read off the slide, but we currently produce several metals and industrial minerals, and we produce several critical minerals already. So this is the part I want to draw attention to. And I'll go through these one by one. But beryllium, we produce currently 10 critical minerals. Now, that does depend on the definition, whether you're using the 2018. You remember on a previous slide I showed you that there was an original 2018 list that's been updated to 2021. The 2021 update was not great for Utah because they removed several of the things that we actually produce. So that was unfortunate. They removed potash. We produce potash. They removed helium. We produce helium. They produced uranium. They removed rhenium, we produced rhenium, so it was a little bit unfortunate. All those are now not critical minerals, but zinc was added, and we do have high zinc potential, even though it's not currently produced. So what we do produce also lithium, and again, I'll be going through these. Lithium, platinum, palladium, and tellurium, those are all byproducts. And I just wanted to contextualize a little bit Utah's kind of mining history. This is kind of my jam as one of the economic geologists for the state. Utah is the third largest historic mining state. So we have a long and proud history of mineral production here, and we are actually the #1 state domestically for beryllium and magnesium metal production, both of which are critical minerals. And I should just clarify on this slide, everything that's in bold is a critical mineral. The bold italicized things are things that were critical minerals but have been dropped off. Sorry, going back to the right-hand side of the slide, we are the second largest historical producer of copper, silver, and vanadium, the third largest historical producer of lead, molybdenum, and uranium, and then also significant iron and gold production as well. A substantial, the vast majority really of this is all sourced from Bingham Canyon. So while we have prolific mining across the state, it is hard to understate the impact that Bingham has had on our mining history, including critical minerals. Okay, so these are two figures from our critical mineral report that I mentioned in the first slide. So you can find this at geology.utah.gov. The left-hand side is a map of the state, and I know it's a very confusing map. It takes a while to kind of look at it, but we're basically showing what is producing, which is the large black dots, what is an established resource, which are the kind of medium gray dots, and what has potential, which are the smaller white dots. Now, we did publish this in 2020, so this is referring back to the 2018 list that has all of the elements that have unfortunately since been dropped. The periodic table to the right, I did update. So this is actually, oh no, I think I take it back. I took the best case scenario and just kept everything that looks good for Utah on there. So what you can see here, the red ones are the elements that we produce in Utah. So we've got a good span across the periodic table. Again, rhenium, helium, and potash, which is potassium sulfate or chloride. Those three have been dropped, but we are also bringing online production of fluorite in Juab County. And I think maybe if people saw, Bingham Canyon made an announcement that they will be adding a tellurium recovery stream to their refinery. So we will actually be produced, I think, and they said by the end of 2021. So they might not be up and running yet, but that should be very soon. So what I'm going to do now is walk through the significant resources that we produce as well as those that we have. And when I say established resource, that means that there has been enough drilling to show to a certain level of reliability that this mineral resource does actually exist, and we're not just waving our arms and making it all up. So established resource has a certain amount of certainty behind it, and then I'll talk a little bit about what there's just kind of quantified potential for as well. So beryllium, it's too bad. I like being in a room like this because when I'm talking about this in particular, because it's always fun to ask if anyone knew that Utah produces beryllium. And then it's fun to follow up that question with, did anybody know that Utah corners the market globally and that in 2020 we produced 65% of the world's beryllium? I don't know if anyone knew that, but I find it a really fascinating little factoid about Utah. So we're the only beryllium producer in the US. Again, we are the global leader. It comes exclusively from the Spore Mountain Mining District, which you can see there in central Juab County highlighted on the map. And this district has been in the mine has been in continuous production since 1968. And what I'm showing there at the bottom, that table, this is just in mineral terms, this is showing how much is left in terms of reserves and resources. What it equates to is that not only have they been in production since 1968, they still have 75 years of mine life at current production levels. So we will also continue to be a significant global beryllium producer into the future. So, this is one of the more fascinating, geologically very interesting deposits in Utah. And so if you need a factoid for pub bingo or anything like that, there you go. Utah cornering the global beryllium production. We are also the only domestic producer of magnesium metal. So that's produced at the, some people might be familiar, the U.S. magnesium plant on the kind of southwestern flank of the Great Salt Lake. It is produced from Great Salt Lake brines. And it used to be associated with the titanium sponge plant that I think is no longer in operation. There's also potential for magnesium from kind of the basinal brines and evaporites, so basically the Great Salt Flats, the salt flats, as well as dolomite, which is what is shown in green on the map. And the reason I have lithium on this slide as well is because lithium, Utah is actually currently a lithium producer. So US Mag is able to produce lithium as a byproduct of the magnesium recovery. I'm going to take a moment just to talk about lithium because obviously there's a lot of interest around lithium with the upsurge in lithium ion batteries. And I think a lot of people look at Utah and think, oh my gosh, look at all the salt flats and brines, should be prime lithium territory. That's not exactly true. So compared to, say, South America, the salars in South America, which are the salt flats in South America, Utah's absolute concentration of lithium is lower. So just the amount of lithium that's there is lower. And also there's more magnesium. So if you were to focus on lithium as a primary commodity, the magnesium is actually a bad thing because it's very expensive to have to separate it out. Obviously for US Mag, that works just fine since that's what they were aiming for in the first place. So for them, it's great. But for other explorers who want to come in and look at the salt flats for lithium potential and the Great Salt Desert, things like that, it's not actually going to be the best resource, particularly in compared to other areas with similar geology like in South America. However, the salt flats, Great Salt Lake, Salt Desert isn't the only area that we can look at for lithium. So the Paradox Basin, there's a company there, Anson Resources. Yep. Anson Resources, they are re-entering old oil and gas wells. I think this is kind of what John was referring to. They're re-entering old gas wells, oil and gas wells, and basically extracting the overpressured brines from those wells and are extracting lithium from that. And they're not up at production levels yet, but they have actually published an established resource. So they're very optimistic that they can turn this into, they can scale it up to a realistic production operation. So that's the other facet of lithium in the state. Fluorite is, well, Utah is actually now going to be the only domestic producer of fluorite. Fluorite and fluorspar are the same thing, and we just flip between the two probably more than we should. Fluorspar, so this is actually the same district that the beryllium comes from, the Spore Mountain district, and a company called Ares Strategic Metals has re-entered the district. They have produced some fluorspar already, but I think they backed off on production in order to kind of continue refurbishing and explore a little bit to expand their mine plan and their extraction plan. So we have produced it. It's on hold at the moment, but I think it's coming back online very, very soon. So platinum, palladium, rhenium, and tellurium. I crossed out radium again, unfortunately, dropped off the critical mineral list in 2021. These are all byproducts of the Bingham Canyon mine. So when I say byproducts, Bingham's main commodities that are produced are copper, molybdenum, gold, and silver. The molybdenum is kind of separated and shipped somewhere else to be refined, but the copper, gold, and silver are all recovered or refined at the Garfield smelter. And as part of that process, as you're refining the copper, all of the impurities kind of drop out during that process. And all of that material that drops out can then have other metals that they extract out of it. So those impurities, which are called slimes, for lack of a better term, I don't know what metallurgist thought that up, but the slimes are what the gold and silver is extracted from. And then the remaining slimes is what the tellurium will now be extracted from. They also produce what's called a selenium crude, and that is a concentrated selenium, platinum, palladium product. And they also produce a lead carbonate. So that's, I said earlier, like, oh, we do produce lead as a byproduct. That's what I was thinking of. Bingham Canyon does produce a lead carbonate byproduct. So lots of things coming out of Bingham Canyon. If anyone saw in the news, I think they are thinking very seriously about what else they might be able to extract from the facility. So we might hear soon about new critical minerals that will be extracted. Bismuth is probably pretty high on the list of what they could extract. So yeah, I think it's great that Rio Tinto is focusing so hard on how they can kind of utilize both the tailings, the mine waste, and still the actively mined material. Aluminum. So, okay, so sorry, all of the elements that I just went through are ones that we are actively producing. I'm going to talk now about the ones that we are not producing, but we have those established resources, meaning we have a certain degree of certainty that it exists. Aluminum, so Utah actually hosts the largest alunite deposit in the US. Alunite is a mineral that hosts both potassium and aluminum. And so this alunite resource is actually viable for potash. Again, that potassium, it's sulfate for this one, potassium sulfate, as well as aluminum. And there have been several companies who've come in and looked very seriously at this. I think with the right economics, this will probably come to pass. There's kind of a critical mass of several things that are borderline economic in that area at the moment. So I think if one thing starts going, there's a strong potential for kind of a generalized industrial area down in the area of Blonde Mountain. And sorry, if you can see on the map, Blonde Mountain is in kind of central western Beaver County. And there are, so I'm just talking about the largest ones right now. There are other resources as well, but Blonde Mountain's the one that I think if one was going to go into production, that would be the one. Indium. So this is one of my favorite ones to talk about. Indium. It turns out indium is really essential to so many modern high-tech technologies. I didn't know this, but there's a thing called indium tin oxide thin film coating. And what it is a transparent electrically conductive coating that can be put on things, and essentially it makes them touch screens. So I don't know that they're actually used on phones, but definitely they're used on like LCD panel displays and touchscreens, and then a whole suite of other things as well. So indium is extremely essential to modern high-tech economies. We have no domestic indium production, and actually this West Desert deposit that I'm showing here in kind of Western Juab County is the only known indium resource in the US. So this is a fairly significant resource that we have here. And it contains enough indium to supply, and actually I recalculated this recently, contains enough indium to supply the US for over 15 years based on current import rates. And not only is it an indium resource, it's also a copper and zinc resource. Copper, as I spoke about earlier, being essential for just about everything, and zinc being a new critical mineral. So this, there's kind of a resurgence in exploration around this deposit. I'm very hopeful to see that maybe this could one day go forward into production. All right, and the last two we're going to talk about for defined critical mineral resources, so essentially established resources, uranium and vanadium. I don't think that will come as a surprise to most people. I think most people are very familiar with the fact that Utah has a very long-lived and kind of prolific uranium and vanadium history, including, for those of you who don't know, the discovery of the Mi Vida mine in Lisbon Valley down in the Paradox Basin by Charlie Steen. That discovery kicked off the whole uranium rush in the Colorado Plateau. So we have some very significant uranium and vanadium history here in the state. There are several permitted mines in southeastern Utah, primarily in the Paradox Basin. There are several permitted mines that are on standby. The uranium price, I heard y'all talking about the oil and gas price. The uranium price is actually doing some similar acrobatics at the moment, and it has been increasing. It was identified as one of the most undervalued commodities across the board. And there's a futures company that's been buying up all of the physical resources or stockpiles of uranium. So we might be looking at a uranium bull run coming up soon. I know that the producers are certainly hoping that that will happen. Utah is uniquely positioned for the uranium and vanadium industry because of the White Mesa Mill in Blanding, Utah. The White Mesa Mill is the only operating conventional uranium and vanadium mill in the United States. So that improves the economics of our deposits just substantially because there is a mill right there that they can deliver the ore to. Just as a side note, and I think it'll actually go in, I think it fits with the next slide. Yeah, anyway. Just as a side note about White Mesa, they have recently pivoted to begin extracting rare earth elements from monazite sands. So the ore that they're extracting rare earth elements from is not from Utah. It's sourced actually from Georgia. But they have worked really, really hard to make the changes to their facility necessary to be able to extract the rare earth. They produce a rare earth carbonate that then gets shipped to a plant in Estonia for further refinement, because rare earth is, that's about, depending on how you count, that's, about 12 elements that can be extracted from there. But what that represents is a rare earth supply chain totally independent of China, and largely 2/3 of it being domestic here in the US as well. So it's been a really substantial success for them. They still have preserved their uranium and vanadium processing ability. Basically what would happen, I think, this is my understanding, is they would stockpile uranium and vanadium. and then switch the plant over and process that for maybe several months to a year while they stockpile rare earth feed. And then they would switch the plant back over to rare earth feed, process rare earths for several months to a year, and kind of switch the plant back and forth like that. So they've tried to maintain their flexibility and the uranium vanadium processing capability while taking that step into the future and trying to create that domestic ability to do the intermediate processing of rare earths. And that feeds into this slide. So I get asked a lot about Utah's rare earth potential. To be honest, it is not fantastic. I don't see any particular potential that we would ever have a standalone rare earth mining operation. But similar to how platinum and palladium are byproducts at Bingham Canyon, there are a few deposits that might have rare earth byproduct potential. And particularly if we do have the mill and Blanding that can process rare earth feed, that might really improve the economics of some of these byproduct potential operations, particularly Spore Mountain. Actually, the Beryllium processing plant, that district is also known for past uranium production, volcanogenic uranium production. And so that could actually be a viable, and there has been some studies that have indicated that there's rare earth enrichment in the tailings or mine waste of Spore Mountain. So that could be a potential feedstock for the White Mesa Mill. And you can see there I've listed several other potential resources. These are things that either have been past produced in Utah, or we know that there is at least some significant enrichment, not necessarily economic, but that depends. Economics can shift. So we just try and figure out what the geology is and put that out there for other people to assess as the economics evolve. Okay, hopefully I didn't go for too long. I meant to start a timer and I forgot to. Apologies. But that was everything I had to talk about for critical minerals today. I would be happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Any questions from the audience here in person? Oh, good. We got one volunteer. John will bring the mic and put him on the spot.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Mike Hyde with the Utah Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office. And with the Biden administration's recent enlargement of the two national monuments down in southern Utah, is the DNR looking at how that's going to impact our ability to access and mine these critical minerals?
Yes. So the Utah Geological Survey had preemptively done both an oil and gas, a coal, and a mineral assessment of the areas falling in both Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head how publicly available those assessments that we did are. They're certainly available within DNR, and I think if you were to talk to either Bill Keach, our director, or Brian Steeds, John might know what I'm talking about as well. Those might be accessible for you. Overall, the mineral potential out there is kind of middling. The main potential would be around uranium and vanadium, potentially copper and cobalt, but unlikely to be large deposits. And the other issue is the infrastructure, because there's so little infrastructure out there, and that really damages a little bit our ability to basically put together an economic operation. So what I would say is having a look at those assessments that we've put together is probably the best way to get an idea of how that's going to impact for the future.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Any other questions from people attending in person? Okay, not seeing any. How about those participants that are online? Okay, not seeing any more. I'd like to take just a moment and thank Stephanie for her presentation today and her time. Now we'll go on to our next presenter. That will be Tyler Wiseman with State Institutional and Trust Lands. And as we'll give Tyler just a moment to get set up and allow him to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. This is pulling up now. All right. So my name's Tyler Wiseman. I work for SITLA. I'm in the oil and gas group. And I split my time between the oil and gas group and the minerals group here. So this presentation is going to be kind of what else can we produce out of our oil and gas wells, specifically helium resources within the state of Utah, but also a lot of this comes from my master's thesis at Texas A&M that kind of was on hydrothermal fluid flow and migration in the mid-continent. So I use a lot of analogs within the mid-continent and throughout the entire US and parts of Canada too. So caveat here is that this is still a growing industry. It's very, right now it's very niche. There's not a whole lot of players involved, and those that are very, they're very guarded. They keep a lot of data very close to their chest. So there's not a whole lot of new information, but luckily there's quite a bit of old publications and old data that we can kind of use to kind of better understand the helium system. So in 2020 with Mark Eccles, through the UGS, published this proven and hypothetical helium resources in Utah. And then, so the outline of this presentation is going to be an overview and significance of helium, and then the helium system, helium generation, primary and secondary helium migration, types of helium reservoir, so a little bit of basin analysis and fluid flow, and then tools for exploration that'll just kind of touch on. These are more guidelines from experts in the field. So. All right, so I guess the first thing to ask is why helium? Why do we care? So helium is used in a lot of high-tech and high-speed industries, specifically in like the medical field, the defense, like historically the defense and aeronautics industries, as well as now the high-tech industries are kind of taking over using it, and especially because of its like inert characteristics. So global demand is increasing significantly, specifically for MRIs. And this is primarily in countries that are just now getting like kind of coming into either second or first world. So we're kind of coming out of the third world and kind of getting more just increasing their status a little bit more. So as well as the semiconductor industries, fiber optics, like I said, high tech. So this specialty gases. So helium is used quite a bit in deep sea diving, as well as other breathing apparatuses like heliox mixtures for asthma and breathing issues. Also, so, but the medical device usage it's generally stable. Primarily, the growth is seen in like the semiconductor and fiber optics industries. But fairly recently, so helium has been and will continue to be a significant player in like the global refrigeration and transportation of COVID-19 vaccines, which is really important right now. And then kind of like what Stephanie was saying, helium was designated a critical mineral by the federal government in 2017. Again, it's been a critical mineral multiple times, but its most recent was in 2017, but then was removed in 2021, primarily due to other global markets in Russia and Qatar and other areas that are coming online. So it's moving towards more of a strategic element because some of those areas outside the U.S. where production is currently active or will become active has some geopolitical issues tied to those areas, like the blockade in Qatar and the issues in the Middle East and different stuff like that. So also of significance to like the supply and demand issues for helium is that the Bureau of Land Management out of Amarillo, Texas, they were originally the basically the guardians of the federal helium reserve out in Amarillo in the Panhandle gas field. And they've been incrementally selling it off, their stock for quite a while. And that's where you see the supply dropping significantly for the US. That's based on the Bureau of Land Management selling it off all their reserves. So, and then that transition creates opportunity for exploration, which is why we're here. So probably asking where's helium, at least what the data is showing where helium is in the US. So this is a map I made earlier this year for the entire North America, at least the publicly accessible helium data throughout the North America. So the Bureau of Land Management, formerly the Bureau of Mines, they would, since 1917, solicit gas samples from oil and gas operators in like production as well as wildcat exploration, and test their gas. So they would actually come out on location or solicit the gas to come to them, and they would test it and get it documented at their Amarillo plant at the Federal Helium Reserve here in Amarillo. As you can see, you can already start seeing, just with the base map, the USGS base map, you can start seeing some interesting trends. You see that certain areas are definitely higher than others. And that also could be significant, like data. Just we're not testing as many gas wells and oil wells as we should be. But we're kind of like sticking towards one specific targeted area, which has historically been the mid-continent. And that's primarily because there's a pipeline for the Federal Helium Reserve that goes from Bushton, Kansas into Oklahoma and then down into Amarillo. So they were really trying to map out really where the helium was in the mid-continent, as well as kind of getting a feel for what's going on elsewhere. And that's when they started to realize that there's quite a bit on the Colorado Plateau, and in the Southern Rockies and Mid Rockies. And then there's a significant drop off in Montana, but that's definitely a data issue. There's not a whole lot of wells tested in Montana. And then the major helium bubbles that you're seeing up in Alberta is because Alberta, they require a gas sample with every well that's drilled. And it's been that way for decades. So quite a lot of their wells, the majority of their wells have a gas sample, and that's all public data, which is kind of nice. Similar with these other, let's see, there you go. So this is like an example of the Bureau of Mines, so Moore and Sigler. Their 1917 and 1985 publication documented like 17,000 gas analyses. And I'll get to what one looks like, but there's like a database for Saskatchewan that I took data from. Same with Manitoba, and then there's the big one in Alberta that was just released in 2020, so fairly recently. And then in northeastern British Columbia, yeah. So, and then just to kind of go back a little bit, so I'll just kind of talk to the map. So. Helium is typically economic at greater than 0.3 mole percent in your gas stream. Obviously, that depends on quite a few parameters, like distance to market. Do you have a stable supply or somebody that's taking it offtake? So this can the economics can kind of range between 0.3 and 0.5. But if you're in that range, you're doing pretty well with your gas. And you can see in Utah and elsewhere on the Colorado Plateau, they're significantly higher than that. And then sample depth. So, and this is kind of a theme for my maps, is I do like heat maps. So the shallower formations that the sample was taken from are going to be in these yellow, and then it's going to get warmer as it gets deeper. And then I just added a transparency so that so you can it blurs out some of the more not relevant samples and kind of makes the other ones kind of pop out a little bit more. So that's just kind of a explanation on the data. So this is typically what a gas sample will look like, at least from the Bureau of Land Management, formerly the Bureau of Mines. So you'd have your legal information, and then your formation information, your pressures, and then your actual gas, your typical gas suite, plus helium. So, and then the helium is down here. So this is talking about Kansas, but we're talking 0.34, 1%, 0.78. So all those are economic, potentially economic helium wells. So then this kind of brings it together, and why we should be focusing elsewhere, for exploration, is because so we saw, if you go back to the map here, the mid-continent, there's a lot, and it's been producing for a very long time. These fields have been producing for over 100 years. And there's also been heavy water floods that have gone in this area, so significant dilution as well as depletion in the reservoirs. So the mid-continent, the one that the Bureau of Land Management has been trying to really understand and map out for those resources, is significantly depleting. These other areas in Michigan, they're pretty much sub-economic, and then same with the like the Permian and elsewhere down in Texas, they're primarily sub-economic. And then Riley Ridge and LaBarge up here in Wyoming, they actually produce the most, or have recently produced the most helium in the world out of the Riley Ridge, or the, what's that plant? Anyway, a plant that's up there. But the issue with the Wyoming, or at least the southwestern Wyoming gas, is that it's really high in CO2, and it's at significant depths in the overthrust. So it's very deep, very high in CO2, high in H2S. It's potential environmental issues for sure. So significant potential exists on the Four Corners and throughout Utah in general, as well as up onto the kind of the southern edge of the Uinta Basin significantly, as well as I think that the hinge line has significant potential as well. And I'll talk about that as we go. So the helium system from source to reservoir. So there's a lot of similarities between the helium system and a petroleum system. There's predictable processes, so generation, migration, entrapment, but that's pretty much where it ends. The source, maturation, migration, and trapping mechanisms are very different. So the processes are similar, but very different. So helium is sourced from the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium in mineral grains, not hydrocarbon source rocks. So just to kind of start things off, to really understand the helium system, you kind of got to understand what areas are significantly enriched in the upper crust with those incompatible radioactive materials. So that kind of goes into Wilson cycles, different modes of transformation from the deep mantle up into the upper crust where helium becomes, or where uranium and thorium become actual potential sources for helium. And this is a map from Alton Brown showing just the generation potential for different rocks. So it's showing sandstone. This would be like a arcosic sandstone. Carbonate is interesting. So this would have to be like a dirty carbonate. So it'd be mixed with some shale, because pure carbonates are not going to have really high uranium contents typically. So, and then average granites and average shales are pretty similar. They're quite one-to-one ratio. So, and then hot shales, so those old uranium enriched or radioactive shales are significantly higher helium potential for generation. So kind of talking Wilson cycle. So we have the incompatible elements in the mantle. They get brought up close to the surface during rifting. And then as that kind of migrates and you have this enriched area in the crust, and then as that goes through its cycle, either through erosion or just becoming a stable continent, you have an enriched area, significantly enriched area for helium to generate from those that uranium and thorium in the crust. So this is just talking a little bit more, kind of getting closer to home in the Uinta Basin. So let's see, talk about. So whether you read up on the Uinta Locogen or the Uinta half graben, there's a few different kind of interpretations. Some say it's not a rift. Some people think that it is, and I think the dollar kind of comes out and says that it's a half graben. So anyway, but we know that it's on the edge of a Archean craton, really old, with sutured terrain that's associated with the joining of the stable craton here. So also rifts are can be very good areas for mineralization, from like that thermal plume, that heat source migrating through like a uranium enriched granitic basement, and then those metal rich fluids interacting with the sandstones, the porous and permeable formations that it can migrate through. All right, so this is kind of just showing like a distribution of failed rifts and the locogens in the U.S. So the mid-continent has the famous southern Oklahoma locogen, and the Wichita uplift associated with it. And then, we have the Uinta Trough, and then the central Montana Trough, and then the mid-continent ridge. Most of these are Precambrian. The Oklahoma locogen is actually early Paleozoic. But so yeah, really old rocks. It takes a lot of time to generate helium from radioactive decay. So you need that long time in those old rocks. And this is just showing other like Neoproterozoic and Mesoproterozoic basins. So you got the Uinta Mountain Group, Big Cottonwood, the Pahrump, and then like the Chouar Basin, Apache. So all these in the west, where Rodinia was splitting apart, kind of seem to be good indicators for a helium or a uranium enriched basement rock, which is the ultimate source. I mean, whether it's coming from sandstones or shales, the ultimate source is the basement. Okay, so, and then you need like a heat source coming from the to kind of like, I guess, liberate that helium from or just to start generation from those, so to kind of, I don't want to say that, initiate generation in the old rocks. So, and that would be the laramide induced magmatism coming through from the subduction of the Farallon plate. And then like the significant Cenozoic igneous intrusions and stuff going around the Colorado Plateau. So I guess it's like sinking in these areas, right? So it's really, really hot, kind of, it gets cooler in the middle, but it's still kind of generating that heat on the edges and generating that kind of convection process. So just as a quick little overview, noble gases and natural systems, they're really good tracers for migration. So they can be used to kind of like fingerprint, your hydrocarbons or whatnot. So, and they can be introduced via like the atmosphere or the mantle or through the crust. So one thing to keep in mind, so mantle helium is helium-3 or primordial helium, and then helium-4 is radiogenic or crustal helium. So those are two separate. So helium-3, if you're finding that in your reservoir, you typically know that you have a magmatic source somewhere near you, because that will become significantly diluted by any kind of helium-4, like crustal helium that comes into contact. So yeah, keep that in mind. So, and this is just kind of showing another interpretation. So you have like hydrocarbon source rock and how noble gases can interact with the hydrocarbons in the groundwater formation water. So this is from Brown 2010 as well. So this is his interpretation. So helium generated by radioactive decay in minerals, again, mineral grains, those diffuse to migrate or to the water, which would be considered primary migration. And then it partitions into a gas phase as soon as it can. And that could be either like a gas that's migrating through the water or the water that the helium is traveling in contacts a gas phase. So it wants to get into that gas phase, and that's just due to Henry's constant. It wants to be liberated from that fluid as soon as possible. It's very buoyant. So so then it migrates with any kind of carrier gas, whether that be methane, nitrogen, or CO2. Typically, it'll migrate with those and then be in the gas accumulation in a very small, minute concentration. But some can be very large, as we've seen on the map. So like a very important process is diffusion, like we talked about. This is just kind of showing it coming from like a quartz grain, either from within, from radioactive decay, or along the edges. It gets into the water, the pore water, and then that pore water is migrating either down dip or up dip, whichever the pressures are allowing it to migrate. And then advection is really important as well. And advection is typically considered like a requirement for high helium gas volumes. You need that to kind of migrate a large amounts of helium towards a gas or a trap in like a short amount of time. And the best way to do that is by introducing like a thermal conduction or a thermal source of some sort that will drive that advection process. And I could, like we talked about, so it could be acid gases, nitrogen, or methane. All right, so this is just like a migration model from Alton Brown. So he's just showing it. It's coming from the water saturated reservoir, and it initiates with a gas kind of coming up dip. You can kind of like, think of this coming out of the basin, migrating upwards, up dip out of the basin. So for this, water saturated mud rock it's going to require like a significant thickness of that mud rock and just a large volume of that to be uranium and thorium rich to accumulate in significant amounts. So this is one actually showing the water coming down dip. So this would be like analogous to the tilt of the mid-continent area, where it's tilting to the east slightly, and you have water and we think helium enriched water kind of migrating in certain areas from the like the Apishapa uplift and the Los Animas arch kind of down dip and getting trapped in these gas little pockets in these reservoirs. So this is one that's more close to home. So this is what we think is going on, at least in the Paradox Basin, or at least portions of the Paradox Basin, where you have a primarily CO2 rich gas, and we're talking like beneath the hydrocarbon zone of the Pennsylvania, so like the Mississippian or the Devonian or Cambrian. So you have like a CO2 rich gas, but as that CO2 rich gas is migrating, it's becoming less and less enriched in CO2 as it reacts out of the formation water due to just water rock reactions. Like it's producing either sulfides or clays or carbonates, stuff like that as it migrates. So then like once it actually reaches a trap, it's more helium and other gas rich, and that CO2 is primarily dropped out. So talking about flows, like the two phases of flow. So nitrogen is commonly seen with helium. There seems to be like a really good correlation. Although they have different sources. So nitrogen can come from a whole bunch of different sources. But it's always typically found with the helium, which may indicate a similar source. Yeah, this is just talking about carbon dioxide. I talked about that already. So one of the big kind of thought processes that we have is that active hydrodynamics are necessary for helium-rich gas. So you have to have that active groundwater flow, and that interaction with the what we're calling like basal brines or basement brines, like that basement sedimentary interface migrating towards like a gas cap. So this is just kind of showing, this is actually from the Appalachia, it's a really good paper from Dara and others, but it's showing how like the Appalachia orogeny has pushed significant amounts of like hydrothermal fluid from beneath these thrust sheets, and then how those are interacting, those fracture networks and the pore water are interacting and migrating the helium via these like intricate pathways. That's kind of what we're thinking is how it's migrating, and it has so it's migrating with a source or a carrier gas. In this case, it's methane. So also, what I should have mentioned or shown in the map is that methane produced in like large quantities will severely dilute your helium to subeconomic amounts. So like that's why we see a lot of helium like on these basement highs or these like uplift basin transitionary zones, where the hydrocarbons is either at its last little bit or just hasn't, is more just in the deep basin center. Like, so helium is not typically found in the deep basin center, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So this is a model that I created. So it's kind of combining a sedimentary and basement source and then that generation, migration, entrapment. So we have like helium coming up from the basement via these like deep fracture networks. And then you also have like a shale down here that had like a uranium and thorium enriched shale. And then it's kind of migrating up dip out of the basin center. And then it kind of meets this sandstone, porous and permeable sandstone layer that's kind of pinched out against the basement, kind of migrating along the basement in certain areas, picking up more and more helium as it migrates. And keep in mind, we got like Paleozoic source rock, cap rock kind of going on right here. And then it kind of migrates towards a trap. And then that has the potential to be helium enriched. So this is just kind of more examples. So methane rich kind of examples are in the mid-continent. So Hugoton Panhandle and Kansas uplift primarily. Nitrogen rich, we have Harley Dome, which Stephanie showed on her map as well. Pinta Dome down in Arizona, and then Model Dome in Colorado, and like the Taos Basin. And then carbon dioxide rich, we got Doe Canyon, Colorado, and LaBarge. Oh, it's the Chute Creek plant up there. That's right. This is just actually an older map. This is made in May 2020, before Alberta kind of published their database. But what I've done is I've like selected out only the significant helium shows. So, and then I like the moderates are in blue, and then like the not relevant, really low subeconomic helium shows are in this like teal, greenish color. So you can start seeing like significant trends. That's why, Utah really stands out, is because there's, of the wells that were tested, at least in the Paleozoic sections, there's really high helium, typically like always associated with it. So, which is definitely a plus. Yeah. All right. So we kind of talked about methane rich, so I won't really go into this, but one other example, I guess, would be the Los Animas Arch that's in the Merrow Sandstone. That's a significant one right now. That has some of the highest helium at 11% helium, but the reservoir is significantly under pressured. So it makes production really difficult. And this is just a kind of a distribution, kind of showing a similar process, what I think is kind of happening in the Uinta Basin. So you got the kind of like an alocogen or like a failed rift kind of thing that's been smashed back together. And then that's creating these, like the Amarillo uplift, Wichita Mountains. And then you got a basin center that's adjacent to it. And then the fluids that are generated in that basin center, and then that migrate up dip, either back up the faults or up dip out onto the foreland. You're going to get contact with these uranium and thorium enriched basement rocks. And that's kind of what we think might be happening, as well as the tilt, like I mentioned earlier, the tilt coming this way and migrating primarily to like the Viburnum, Trenton, Missouri-ish area. So you have like this easterly tilt that might be driving groundwater flow and picking up helium as well this way, so to the east, as well as out of the basin this way, like these ways. That's just another example. Anadarko Basin, there's not a lot in there. That's primarily because it's really hydrocarbon rich, as well as a lot of water floods probably damage the reservoir, at least for helium's sake, because you're pumping the water down into the basal sandstone where the helium actually occupies. So, all right, so then going back into nitrogen-rich field analogs, Harley Dome, Model Dome, and Pinta Dome. These ones are really interesting as they're like really shallow gas wells, which is interesting because you'd think, helium is typically found at in the deep near the basement, and with like a really significant pile to kind of slow it down from just escape into the atmosphere. But that's actually not what we're seeing. So I got Harley Dome. We're not really. I mean, there's this is the its reservoir is the Entrada sandstone, and so it's actually really close to the Uncompahgre uplift. So you have a close granitic basement, like right beneath. I think the Chinle lays on top of the Uncompahgre there, the basement rock there. So you don't have a lot from the basement to the actual Entrada reservoir. But there's not a really good seal. There's the Tidwell member that's a pretty dense, kind of sandy, shaly rock, but it's not very, I don't know, it seems odd that it would slow down helium that much to accrue in the amounts that it does at Harley Dome, which is up to 7.5%, and as well as like almost 90% nitrogen. That's why we kind of think that it's more migrating from within the basin, like along these basal sandstones, like the Weber potentially, even deeper. And then that kind of gets migrated back up dip from these fault plains, and then kind of migrates out. That's a to be determined. And similar to what's going on at Pinta Dome, a really good analog to Harley Dome is Pinta Dome. Not a lot has been written on Harley Dome. In my paper, I tried my best to kind of like find any really good understanding of like the hydrocarbon, but there's not, more work needs to be done on Harley Dome, but there's a lot that's been done on Pinta Dome. So I've used Pinta Dome as a reference for Harley. And the model dome is kind of its own beast, for sure. So. All right, carbon dioxide. This one's, we talked about, it's significant to Utah, as well as up north in Wyoming on the LaBarge platform. So the good thing about when I digitized for my master's, I digitized the entire like 17,000 rows of data in those Bureau of Mines publications. And the good thing about that is now I have, I can do the same kind of bubble map with CO2 as I did for helium. So I've mapped out the CO2 in the area versus helium. So CO2 I did in like the light blues to dark blue, and then helium keeps its same color distribution. But you're kind of seeing some interesting trends. Typically where there's really high CO2 concentration, the helium is not in the greatest amounts. It's not to say that the volume of the helium isn't large, but the concentration itself is diluted by that CO2. And that's also what's going on in LaBarge. It's deep in the Bighorn dolomite, the Devonian, as well as the Madison limestone. At really high concentrations of CO2 and H2S, which is not good. So this is just a quick graph showing helium concentration versus sample depth. So of all the roughly 17,000 gas analyses, most of them are kind of hang out in this range, right? It's between 0 and 1%. And then you get these outliers that are kind of show an interesting distribution. Harley Dome is at very low reservoir depths, high concentration, similar to Pinta Dome. The Los Animas Arch has that high helium concentration, but underpressured as well. That's an issue that Harley Dome struggles with. So it seems to be like the underpressured reservoirs that have these high helium concentrations. There's a kind of a correlation between the two. And a lot of work has been done by Daniel Halford out of the Colorado School of Mines, and Dana Ballin out of the UK to kind of like understand why that might be. So I would refer to those papers for sure if you have any follow up on that. So just a quick few examples of basins and kind of like the fluid flow migration pathways and how they could be influencing helium. So this one is a gravity driven fluid flow. So this could be associated with like the mid-continent as well as the areas in like the severe, kind of where you get meteoric water that circulates deep into the basin centers that is also kind of hitting those crustal fluids that are migrating outwards out of the basin. So you kind of get a mixture going on. Let's see if I want to. So yeah, So basically, so it'd be picking up helium as it's kind of along these basal sandstones from the interaction with the fracture network of the basement. So you can kind of see this is like an analog for a fractured basement. You know, you got all these pore network or fracture networks that are kind of connected. This can also be very highly mineralized as well as, you know, brecciated. So it's coming through typically at high pressures and hot, and kind of, bulldozing its way through and kind of picking up anything that it can in its pathway. So then as it migrates up dip to like a basement high or some sort of trapping mechanism, it can kind of stop and get halted there long enough for us to explore for it and hopefully produce out of it. So the analog to that one, like I said, is the southern mid-continent. This kind of just shows it. We've seen this image already, but it's showing fluid flow coming up the fault plains. And then as soon as it gets to like a porous and permeable formation, it starts migrating laterally. So it migrates vertically as best it can, kind of up dip. And there's some interesting kind of studies going on with fault valve pumping and all this stuff kind of that's pumping water out along these like active faults, as well as, you know, it's migrating out up onto the foreland here. So, and then this is just kind of a map showing the distribution of just hydrothermal fluid flow in general, and how those have likely influenced the helium in the mid-continent. So this is orogeny driven. So this would be like the severe orogeny. You got like metamorphic and hydrothermal fluid caught up in these thrust sheets, getting pushed and squeegeed out and getting, you know, pushed up dip and out of the these fractured basement basins. So, and then the hydrothermal fluids, they move out towards the thrust front. And then hopefully you get like a compaction structure over basement high, and you can get a good seal and a good reservoir. So the analog for this is the Western Wyoming overthrust belt. So like the Moxa Arch, LaBarge platform area. So multiple thrust belts or thrust sheets have been, has pushed the Devonian and the Mississippian significantly at depth here. And that's likely inducing TSR, so thermochemical sulfate reduction, which can eat the hydrocarbons and leaving kind of like a remainder of CO2, H2S, and any kind of other gases, and in this case, helium in the reservoir. So we think that that's kind of what's going on at LaBarge. And like I said earlier, this has recently been the largest producer of all helium in the world, and not in very high concentrations. So we're talking like 0.6% at LaBarge. So not in high concentrations, but the volumes are just enormous. But they're economically or environmentally sensitive areas for sure. So, all right. So then thermally driven fluid flow, like within a permeable unit or within a basin or a rift. So this is kind of showing that you got a mixture again of like topographic driven flow, whether that's meteoric or like pore water that's getting pushed down from other up dip sources. So the fluids are getting pushed down into the basin, and then they're getting kind of trapped between either like a thermal body or like salt layers or something that's allowing for that like kind of thermal convection going on. And then that's driving fluid flow, and then significant enrichment in helium in these kind of scenarios. So this is kind of, I talked a little bit about that seismic pumping that's going on. So you got like an earthquake that happens, and for a short amount of time that fault plane is is opened, allowing a lot of water and hydrothermal fluid to kind of migrate up dip quickly out of that along that fault plane. And then, you know, if it's CO2 rich or H2S or whatever, has high mineralization going on, and then it can seal back up periodically and then kind of be reactivated multiple times. So definitely what we think is going on in Utah, especially kind of like the southern Book Cliff type areas. I think if you do an overlay of, I didn't for this, but if you do an overlay for helium with active faults, there seems to be a good correlation as well. This is the analog for thermally driven fluid flow. So like I said, this is Paradox Basin. This is the Lisbon field area. So Lisbon, and then Lisbon Southeast in Colorado, kind of a similar thing going on. So this is from Chitsey and others, 2020. So they're fairly recent publication. So you have, and so in between in the Paradox Basin, there's like some igneous intrusions, these big laccolith intrusions, as well as just smaller dikes and diatrines and all these other kind of igneous rocks. And those have induced heat, specifically within like the carbonate rocks that may have, so the CO2 might be even coming from the igneous intrusion itself, or just the emplacement of those igneous intrusions within thick carbonate rocks. Anyway, so that's the fluid, or like the carrier gas, you know, and then it's migrating along the basal sandstones, up dip, up these faults, and then it kind of gets trapped in like a porous permeable sandstone, and it starts its convection, and then it kind of makes its way towards like the top structure. And then also you could get like the refluxing brines that are contributing to the system as well, heat to the system, driving more thermal convection. So, and then so what's interesting is there's quite a lot of dolomite in the Mississippian of the Paradox, as well as a lot of brecciated rocks. A lot of the reservoirs are at least adjacent to like fault zones that are highly brecciated. And that may be due to hydrothermal dolomitization going on from these like basement brines kind of migrating up dip along the basal basement sand interface there. So this is just an example of the fractured rocks, also from Chitsey and others 2020, and brecciated rocks deep from the cores in the Lisbon field. All right, so just quickly, some models, some helium models, they all are very similar. So this is just one in China. It's basically microfractures and pores. They link up and form like distinct pathways for the helium and other dissolved gases after like overcoming a capillary like failure or like a fracture. And then those migrate up dip and get associated with a gas deposit. So this is Western Australia. So this is also in a rifted environment. Or a locogen, so a failed rift that's been smashed back together. So we have helium coming up from the basement and filling these basal sandstone little pockets in the reservoirs here, kind of migrating up dip from these faults, escaping out that way. And then these salt bodies, these intrusive salt bodies, diapirs, are similar to the Paradox Basin, what we see down there. All right, so, and then, yeah, this is the Craddock and others, 2017, this is a good paper on mantle and crustal gases of the Colorado Plateau. So this is a good reference for anybody interested. I'd read up on this. He talks about these massive suture zones, these, what is that, northeast, southwest, lineaments that the helium's kind of accumulating adjacent to, at least the high concentrations. So, and then like I said earlier, so the Colorado Plateau is kind of crumbling on the outskirts and kind of migrating its way in, is what the magnetism is telling us. So you got that heat source, it's kind of driving everything towards the center of the Colorado Plateau as well. So you got like a young intrusive into some very old rock that's generating that helium. So this is Daniel Halford's paper from the School of Mines in 2018. Really good publication. He spent most of his time down on the Four Corners, so like in on Navajo land down there, specifically in their connection with like the diatremes and the volcanic complex that's down there, and how the helium and the potentially primordial helium is migrating through there and sourced from those diatremes, and then how it kind of migrates up dip out of the along fault plains and whatnot to an actual porous and permeable formation, and then those migrate within a gas stream towards a structural trap. And then just kind of in summary, this is kind of showing the petroleum system versus a helium system. So there's quite a lot that's different. I mean, like we talked about, they have a similar generation, migration, and entrapment, but the actual mechanisms are very different. You guys can read up on that. So this is kind of just a generalized exploration for any sort of resource, but starting with basin analysis, understanding what's going on in the geologic history, doing some geophysical work, low impact, low cost, and then surface geochemistry. So this is big for helium. So helium, like it's really buoyant and it wants to escape as soon as it can. So there's like surface seeps all the time that are showing like helium anomalies, and those can be used to kind of potentially trace where the helium is actually coming from. If it's coming from like a leaky seal somewhere or whatnot. So those can be used like these soil gas samplings that go down like 6 feet or just a few feet down, sampling whatever's coming up. And then obviously the leasing, seismic, and drilling. So, and then these are just some exploration guidelines from Brown 2010. I have the references in here, and whoever wants this presentation, feel free, you can take it and use the references, go back and kind of look at these. So basically his summary is exploring old sediments with old pore waters. So finding those areas where old pore waters have either been displaced and pushed elsewhere, or where they have been untouched in like these really old basin like highs and stuff. So and then these are exploration guidelines from Dana Ballin 2017. So an area of shallow crust. She was more interested in looking for like these nitrogen rich. So Brown was more interested in like producing it from natural gas. Dana Ballin is like more interested in finding these like what we call pure helium plays. So like these nitrogen rich, very, very low methane concentration. But you're still exploring for it the exact same way as you would oil and gas, using the same kind of mentality as you would. You're just not looking for that methane, you're looking for that nitrogen and helium combination. And then get back to Utah. So this is the publication that Mark and I published. And then this is a strat column kind of showing, this is just a generalized strat column for all like pretty much eastern Utah. I know there's definitely formations that are off here, but these are like the main ones, and just kind of referencing the formations that have significant helium enrichment. as well as like CO2 enrichment in the blue stars. And so you got pretty much what I see here when I look at this. I see two helium systems. I see a Paleozoic helium system, and then I see like a Jurassic helium system. So two helium systems separated by a thick layer of salt potentially, as well as just, I mean, you're in different areas in Utah. So anyway, that is all I have. These are the select references, many more, but these are kind of some of my favorites on helium. So yeah, I'll take any questions. I'm sure you guys have some. I know I can talk at length about helium, so appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. Let's start with the audience here. Any questions for Tyler from the audience here?
Thanks, John. Thank you, Tyler. This is Steve Lund. Couple
Steve.
questions for you on completion methods on some of these specific helium exploration projects. And I'm still not real clear on the trapping mechanism, but can you go through what you know about the completion methods, if they are different than a typical oil and gas completion method?
Yeah. So completion, from what I know, and so I studied like pretty much all just like the initial exploration. So I haven't dived head deep into the production side, and that's still, honestly, that's still being kind of worked out. Like I said, helium is very in its kind of infancy, at least for exploration. But production methods, what has historically been done is like open hole. I know that some people down in the Four Corners have fracked into these like Devonian sands with minor, some success for sure. But from what I know, especially at like Harley Dome, it's open hole, and then you produce it for, you can produce it as much as you have pressure for, right? Because these are like typically under pressured. And then so sometimes you get a year, you'll get 6 months out of the year. Sometimes you'll get less than that, and then you shut it in, let that pressure build back up, and then go back in and start your production again. And another thing I hope that answers your question a little bit, but another thing on production is that, so production requires either cryogenic, so, and that's typically really expensive to have a cryogenic processing plant. But Utah has a cryogenic plant at Lisbon. I'm not exactly sure. In 2020, it was going back online. I'm not exactly sure if it's taking heat or stripping helium right now, or if it's acting more of like just a kind of a processing plant for natural gas. But the other methods, like in these like frontier areas, like the Harley Dome, and then in other areas like Temple Springs, like let's go to this here. So Harley Dome, right? And then like the Temple Springs area, like this is the Nicoya Arch, kind of on like the northwestern edge of the Paradox Basin. So these are like fringe areas, right? Like not a whole lot of production going on oil and gas wise, as well as, so you're in the remote areas, and they're using what are called pressure swing absorption. So instead of like freezing out the helium due to like its significantly low freezing temperatures, you're kind of doing a quick pressure change to drop out all the other gases, and then your remaining gas is that helium. And I know that those are pretty expensive, but I know that that industry is actually growing significantly. There's quite a few like midstream operators that are diving head first. Like I would check out some companies in like the mid-continent. They're kind of pioneering that whole pressure swing absorption for helium pure play exploration. So
Thank you,
does that
Tyler.
help?
You bet. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, other questions from the audience here? How about online? Hey, Tyler, can you hold up just a second before you take your slides?
Yeah.
Okay, not seeing any online. Would you be willing to go to slide number 4?
4.
So I just kind of was going to summarize for the group a little bit, a couple takeaways I had on this. The first thing, I don't think Tyler talked about this, but the first item being that, as I understand it, helium's lighter than air. So as it becomes exposed, it actually leaves the atmosphere.
Yep.
The other, and I think that's kind of important. The other thing is I asked him to bring this graph up. U.S. supply is declining. Some of that's led to the strategic reserve that he's talking about in Amarillo. And then the third thing, I think he maybe had that in another slide, I don't remember which one it is the uses are increasing and being diversified of helium. So it's kind of interesting where once we expose it, it leaves the atmosphere, our reserves are declining, and we're actually using it in more things. So that's all I was going to add. Thank you, Tyler.
Yeah.
So at this point, we'll go to the collaborative part of the meeting and see if there are folks in person or online that have items they want to bring up. So I'm going to start here in the room and in person, and I can see two individuals in the back, so I'm going to corner them. Hopefully I'm not going to put them on the spot too much, but from a legislative perspective, Representative Lund or Senator Winterton, any things that you would like to present or talk about with the collaborative today?
You know, I'll tell you, there's a couple things that Senator Winterton.
Give us just one moment to get you a microphone. Sorry.
There's a couple things that are interesting, and I think we need to make sure that we keep them on the front burner. And Senator Winterton has been very good at that, and that's this railroad and the right of way and where it is as far as the EIS has been received, and I think it's done. In addition to that, I'm a big advocate of the idea of being able to get pipeline right of ways in that same railroad right of way, and just things to think about to move that forward. Any access we can have to get this Uinta Basin quote unquote wax out, we need to use as much as possible.
I think for most everybody, we know that the update for the railroad, we're just waiting for a vote from the Surface Transportation Board now. Everything is looking like it's all green lights for us, but we hope to have that by the end of the month. They're supposed to meet this month. And so with that, I mean, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people to gear up and to start looking towards the future of a stronger demand for our oil and opportunities that way. But anything that you guys are needing, I mean, both Representative Lund and I would be happy to make it legislatively and make those changes as we go forward, because there is a lot of talk about the hydrogen and the possibilities of that. And we'll just have to see where that goes. But it's just new enough still that there's a lot of questions still unanswered. But for the basin here, I think that fossil fuel's not going to go away, and we're going to need that product. And hydrogen is far enough down in the future there that people shouldn't get down in the mouth over thinking about, we're doomed because of this green energy. It's not. So appreciate everybody being here.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Sorry to put you on the spot first, right in the collaborative part, but legislative was first on my list, and I could see you both sitting together. So anything from online? Yes, Ricky.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. Apologies for not being there in person, but there's a few UPA announcements I just wanted to highlight. I wanted to thank everyone that participated in our Shootout Hunger food drive. In the month of September, we raised more than 4,000 pounds of food that went to the Duchesne County Food Bank. So it's more than 2 tons of food. So wanted to definitely thank XCL, who was the largest per person donator, but also Uinta, Finley, Ovintiv, Barry, and Karis, who all participated. That was a great way for us to really stand up and support the community. Some things coming ahead. We have our monthly lunch and learn coming up on Tuesday, the 26th at noon. And this month, we're going to be talking about federal policy and looking at some of the important decisions ahead, including the reconciliation package that has a number of very troubling provisions that would increase costs for our industry. We're going to be kicking off a new initiative called Latch the Hatch on Wednesday, October 27th at 8 a.m. We've talked about Uinta Basin ozone challenges quite a bit with this group, and we are doubling down on our efforts as we approach the winter season to do everything we can to make sure those leaf hatches stay closed. That's going to be an important part of helping us get through this winter. If anyone's interested in more about that, just let me know. But we're really excited about the Latch the Hatch campaign, and you'll see signage changing out in the basin and hear more about that. And then just two other quick announcements. Our inaugural Safety and Environmental Awards are currently open. We'd love to have nominations. You can nominate an individual, a team, a project, a company, both for safety and environmental projects and initiatives. Those are going to be due November 1st. All the information's on our website. And then the last thing is just pencil into your calendar. Our annual meeting is coming up on January 13th and 14th. We're going to do a snow Basin Ski Day on the 13th with a lunch and a après-ski reception, and then our conference in Ogden on the 14th. So thanks. Sorry, hope I didn't take up too much time, Bart.
No, thank you, Ricky. Okay, any items from the counties? I don't see anybody in person. I'm a little bit handicapped on the online portion. Any items from the counties? Okay, not seeing any. How about from agencies? Okay, not seeing any hands online or anybody jumping up here in person. From the group as a whole, any items that you'd like to discuss or bring up while we're here today? Yes.
Just want to, I can stop out, John. How are things going with the West Star issue on the P&As and what's going on with, is that something we can talk about in here?
That'd probably be an item better to talk off online if you're okay with that.
You bet. Thanks.
Okay, you bet. Okay, one last question that I've got for the group. So we had 64 participants. I had them broke down and now I've forgot the numbers. I think it was pretty close to equal in person and online. I think we had a few more online. Any subjects that those of you either online or in person would like for us to try and bring and have presented in the future? We try to kind of bring content that we think might be interesting to you or relevant, but sometimes it's hard to kind of gauge what you're looking for. So if anybody has any suggestions that they would like for subjects in the future, feel free to speak up right now. We might make you speak in the microphone, but or contact us afterwards online, email, whatever. We'd be interested. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Dominion Energy Questar Pipeline, I just had lunch with the marketing reps last week, and I told them that they needed to be, well, we missed them big time at the Uinta Basin Energy Summit because there's been so much talk about gas constraints coming out of the Uinta Basin. Realistically, it's DEQP who has the biggest footprint in terms of taking the gas out for us and then looking forward to the future. So they're definitely interested in coming out. I suggested to them that they be here at this meeting as well as obviously next year, for the Energy Summit, but and then potentially for a lunch and learn. Ricky, if you're still on, I think they're probably a pretty good option. But they're very interested. They're ready to show up at either of those. And I can get you those contacts if you want, Bart.
Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, any other items from the group? Well, not seeing any, I think we'll call it adjourned, and I appreciate everybody coming. I know fall is kind of a busy time for many of us and a little bit of unsettled weather coming into this. So thank you everybody for coming, and we will get an announcement out for our January meeting here shortly.